Well over a month since India went into lockdown, what's clear is that India's COVID-19 graph is linear and not exponential. The government says this indicates that India's strategies in the fight against COVID-19 are succeeding. As India wages a united battle, our R&D laboratories have turned into war rooms with scientists leading the charge. So is the scientific community rising to the challenge posed by COVID-19? To talk about that and more, we have with us K. Vijayraghavan, India's Principal Scientific Advisor to the Government of India. Welcome, Mr. Raghavan, to DD India. Ram Emanuel said that you must never let a serious crisis go into waste. We are seeing a lot of innovations taking place in our R&D institutions, from developing low-cost testing kits to developing low-cost ventilators to the RT-PCR kits, which are of immense use today, to a medical device that you insert under the bed and that turns the bed into a step-down ICU. So is our scientific community rising to the challenge?
Well, thank you. Our scientific community is rising to the challenge in incredible ways. But it's important to understand what the basis for that is. The basis for that comes from our years of investment in science and technology, in engineering, and in startups. This combination, which were doing incredible things in the pre-COVID era, have risen to the occasion to use every aspect of their knowledge, their science and technology, to reinvent themselves into doing what is needed in this emergency. For example, there are people who are doing mathematical modeling of all sorts of esoteric things, and those people today have gone into understanding what needs to be done to develop apps, for example, such as the Arogya Setu, to make sure that contact tracing and tracking go well. There are others who have reinvented their startups to make ventilators or biomedical equipment or testing kits. So this has been really very good, and there have been also very truly fundamental innovative solutions to drug discovery, vaccines and testing which have come about.
So what is being done to incentivize innovations in the medical technology sector and to catalyze the scientific community?
Well, one of the consequences of this pandemic is that it's amazing that people don't need incentivization. They really have jumped up and gone into this in a collaborative way, which is incredible. But what they need is facilitation in terms of connections with each other and in terms of getting components together to do things, to know what each other are doing so that they work complementary and not in terms of being redundant, and then connecting them to manufacturing. So it's more about that kind of integration of the supply chain at every level, which is what they need and which is what we're doing.
And is there an accessible repository of all the scientific knowledge that India must have mustered so far, or of the scientific progress that India has made in the fight against COVID-19 so far? Incremental it may be, but is there a repository in place?
Yes. There are multiple repositories for different kinds. So in terms of the startup and the translational side, there have been Startup India and Invest India have got really good compilation of what everything is being done. This integrates everything which the demand side might need, the hospitals, the cities and so on might need. Our science agencies tell us what in their websites what is happening, and all of this is also integrated at the Principal Scientific Advisor's website, where we get an overall summary of what is going on.
Prime Minister says that the biggest lesson from these testing times is to become self-reliant. Is India planning to do a strategic long-term rethink in order to ensure that there are greater local manufacturing capacities, for instance, more medtech zones, because we are dependent on imports for most of our critical medical device components?
Yes, indeed. This is, we are undergoing a dramatic change from a previous world order to a new world order. And we must understand the nature of the previous old world order and what we need to do going into the new world order. In the previous world order, we were dominated by several supply chain monopolies which decided what we could do and what we couldn't do. Many countries in the world, India included, had a big challenge in becoming manufacturing hubs as opposed to merely assembly hubs, and our exports were a consequence of assembly rather than fundamental manufacturing. This is now a transition where we're getting back into capturing components of fundamental manufacturing, whether it is chemistry, chemicals needed for drugs, or components needed for phones and communication, or for manufacturing in the textile industry. All of this are things which are happening right now at breakneck speed for us to do things even as we are fighting against COVID-19. And this will roll on post COVID-19 into developing India as a substantial manufacturing center.
And are we looking at a transformation as far as this entire scientific landscape in India is concerned? Is this crisis an opportunity for that, both in terms of funding as well as culture? Because we see that 60% of the funding that takes place in R&D is through government sources, and the gross expenditure on R&D is to the tune of 1.7% of GDP. That's how it's been for 10 years. We're looking at 2% of GDP by 2022 as a target. And also in terms of culture, do we need a more robust response to challenges and problems? Should our solutions be attuned to that?
One of the aspects of the previous structure, and I refer to the previous structure because we have to change that structure now. The previous structure looked at different components because they were historically there, such as investing in our science agencies and their institutions, the private sector science institutions, our startup ecosystem, and our industry. And everyone had a worldview depending on who they were. Academia had a worldview that they are doing a great job if only industry would collaborate, or if only the rules and regulations were easier. Startups felt that they needed more flexibility of this kind or that kind. Industry felt that academia was not reaching out enough. Academia felt that industry was not reaching out enough. Well, those are all very interesting and important debates which go on as we discuss how much to invest in science and what to do, and they are legitimate debates. Today, the urgency had shown how in this urgent situation we can actually break those barriers and work together. Now our challenge is to institutionalize this as we go ahead. And the question is, how can we institutionalize it? Previously we were constantly debating, can we do this, can we institutionalize it, and so on and so forth. But now we know that we can do it, and therefore we must do this urgently. And that brings me to the context of funding. In a situation where we have gone through great economic difficulties now, funding is not going to be easy. And therefore, we must learn to be more efficient in our use of funds and partner with industry and philanthropy in a manner where we can do both fundamental and applied things which will transform Indian context into something which is truly innovative across different sectors and truly world leading. And it can be, and we have shown that we can do that, and I'm sure we can take that ahead.
India is a major hub as far as vaccine manufacturing is concerned. Any indigenous leads that India has had for a vaccine against COVID-19?
You're absolutely right about India's strong vaccine presence. If you look at 3 vaccines which every child in the world gets, 2 of them are made in India. So Indian vaccine presence is absolutely enormous globally. But India is not yet a major vaccine innovator. That again, this crisis has changed enormously. Indian vaccine companies have gone into vaccine innovation in a big way. All the major players have each come across with their version of what they would like to try. There are different kinds of vaccines one can make. These are vaccines based on the virus's genetic material. Others make a viral product and then look at how you can raise antibodies to that. And there are multiple other kinds using various scaffolds, other viral scaffolds to insert aspects of SARS coronavirus 2 so that you can make vaccines. Each of these technologies are very complex, and it's amazing to see, very refreshing to see how Indian academia and industry have come together to do this. Which will succeed, we don't know. There are about 90 different vaccine attempts all over the world, and these are good lottery tickets which we've bought all over the world. So it's also time for us to look at this globally and see, should we make a vaccine early, we should make sure that that vaccine is available for all of India and all of the world. And similarly, if someone else makes a vaccine, we should make sure it's available for all of the world and all of India. That kind of interaction internationally is also happening to ensure.
Okay. Our talks reaching any finality on that front? Because India is participating in WHO solidarity trials for drugs, and like you said, several world leaders have actually committed that they'll be fast-tracking the process of developing drugs, vaccines, tests, etc., and will be making them available the world over. Is India reassured that if there is a breakthrough elsewhere, Indian public will be able to access that?
Well, there are two components, as you mentioned. One is the solidarity trials. India is indeed working with WHO on the solidarity trials. That's held, that's been driven by the Indian Council for Medical Research. Those trials right now involve drug trials of various kinds, but they will soon include vaccine trials also, hopefully. In addition to that, India is participating with the WHO and international organizations. There's a very strong Indian presence there to make sure that vaccine development and deployment and manufacturing are done in an equitable manner for the world.
Any leads in India as far as drug discoveries are concerned, or repurposing existing drugs for COVID-19?
Well, there are two components to this. One is new drugs, and the one other is repurposing existing drugs. We must keep in mind the nature of viral illnesses. Viruses use to greater or lesser extent, usually to a greater extent, our own machinery to replicate. Therefore, a drug against a virus is not easy, because it will also attack our machinery in addition to attacking the virus. A specific drug is not easy. So, that is one challenge. The other challenge with the virus is that you need to have a drug which attacks the virus at the early stage. If you attack it later, then there are too many virus particles there for the drug to be effective. This again poses a challenge. Despite this, for some viruses there have been good drugs, but those are very few. And the repurposing, taking existing drugs which work in other contexts and try them out, is an exercise which we might be lucky. It will be fantastic if we are lucky, but it requires very careful trials to see whether that's happening or not.
There's a lot of interest worldwide in a drug called hydroxychloroquine. Donald Trump had weeks ago called it a game changer. We've exported this drug to several countries, including the United States, and now the US FDA has cited side effects to say that it should be used under strict medical supervision in hospitals or after clinical trials. What is India's position on HCQ? Has it changed? Is it likely to change going forward?
Well, hydroxychloroquine, as you said, is a drug which is used primarily for malaria, but is also found to be effective for some other illnesses such as rheumatoid arthritis and an autoimmune disease called lupus. And the way it works in many contexts is that it changes the acidity of internal cellular compartments inside the cell. And in this case, we know that the virus needs a certain kind of acidity for it to survive and go. And if that acidity is altered, then the virus may not survive. And in the lab, in tests in cell culture and petri dishes, hydroxychloroquine has shown to be effective. And that's why the hope springs that it might be effective in humans. But there's a great leap from what happens on a dish in the lab to what happens in humans, and that's why you need trials. The challenge in the trial is very simple. A, does it do good? B, does it not do harm? Those are the reasons why you need trial. If a drug which is approved doesn't do any harm at all, and you don't know whether it does much good or not, people sometimes still use it in the hope that, okay, it might just work. But if it does harm, then it's not good. Therefore, good trials are needed for both, whether it does good and for harm. And the examples you mentioned increasingly point to great care needed in the use of hydroxychloroquine.
There's a lot of interest worldwide in another drug, and that's remdesivir. However, reports suggest that after the first clinical trial was done in China on patients showing severe symptoms of COVID-19, it showed no impact. But Gilead, the company that owns the patent for the drug, says that it may be effective in milder cases. To your mind, is this still a potential drug?
Well, let's see how the results pan out. Gilead has, I think, at least about 5 or 6 global trials going. The report you mentioned is from one such trial, and we don't have the full results out yet, and we need to see. That drug is interesting in a different way, and that may have some effects for the following reasons or not. One has to test it out and find out. What remdesivir does is it blocks the replication of the viral genetic material. The virus needs to replicate its genetic material precisely for it to remain the same and continue to get packaged and get propagated. Remdesivir blocks that replication, that the mechanism of correct replication in many contexts, again in the lab and again in some other contexts it's been done. Now the challenge is that will it work for SARS coronavirus 2, and we don't know, those trials are ongoing. But that again is something which we have to see. Despite this one potentially negative report, we'll wait for the others to come. That should come in a couple of weeks' time.
Convalescent plasma therapy is being used in India in some cases. Is it effective according to you, and how has India's past experience been with this therapy? Also, are there risks associated?
So the assumptions behind using convalescent plasma therapy are that plasma from a person who is recovered would be very valuable in having protective components of antibodies and such, and might help someone who is under critical condition. That's a good hypothesis again. And it's worked for many other diseases in many other contexts. Whether it will work over here or not, again a trial needs to be done, and therefore any such attempt to use it must take great care so that that information is very valuable to take a larger decision, and that it's done properly so that the patient's life and well-being are under control.
Herd immunity is one concept that is also being discussed worldwide, and some countries have also used that as a strategy. Sweden, for instance, the top epidemiologist of Sweden says that they are close to reaching herd immunity. Now, tell us that what are the countries that can deploy herd immunity as a strategy, because several doctors, scientists and even government ministers have said the world over that once herd immunity is reached, then the spread of the virus would become less of a threat.
Well, first of all, we need to appreciate in general what herd immunity is. Herd immunity means that if you have a group of people in which a significant number are immune to the virus, and this immunity could come because they've been exposed previously or they have a vaccine against the virus. And because a significant number are immune, they protect others in the community who are not been exposed to the virus. They sort of surround them, and the virus sees a barrier beyond which it cannot go. Now, the important point is, what is the percentage of people who need to have been exposed to the virus and have recovered for the community to have herd immunity? In some diseases, it's as low as 40%. In others, it could be higher. Much depends on the nature of the disease, how rapidly it spreads, how people with symptoms spread it, do people without symptoms spread it. Now, with SARS coronavirus, we don't know yet what level of people have been exposed, and we don't know yet how many people have immunity after they have exposed and how long that immunity lasts. This information is coming up now. As we get that information more and more, we will be in a stronger position to judge whether the population herd immunity is a feasible way out or not, but it's too early to say.
What do we know about the lethality of the virus in terms of when it moves from one country to another, as the virus mutates? Does it become any less lethal or less virulent? Is there a less virulent strain of the virus in India compared to other countries, for instance?
Well, in terms of the virus's virulence, which would be typically measured by how it spreads and how it affects physiologically different people, we don't have any reason to think that it's behaving differently in India, except we know from studies from what is happening elsewhere and what's happening in India, that demography of the population, the age distribution of the population, is an important component. Older people are affected, and people who are very old are affected more. People with other indications such as diabetes, hypertension, heart illnesses would all also be more likely to be affected. And this is true for India also. It's not that that's not the case. India, though, has got a much younger demography, and therefore the smaller percentage of fatalities which we are seeing could be potentially explained by that demography. But we need to see still how that pans out. But that is a very likely explanation rather than any explanation of the changes in the virus. We don't know how the virus affects different populations. Do they affect different communities with different genetic background differently or not? We don't know yet.
Reports have come to the fore of some pet cats, some tigers and lions having tested positive for COVID-19. Does this establish the transmission of the virus first from animals to humans and from humans to animals?
So, I've seen those reports of a few zoo animals and a cat being infected. We don't know yet whether that infection has any pathological meaning, whether that results in symptoms which are in the animal itself, and then whether the animal itself is a source or not. People are watching that very carefully, but so far the evidence for animal of those kinds to human transmission in a dynamic manner are not there.
Well, we are hearing the bells in the background, and that reminds me of the 5 p.m. moment when the world and in fact India united, and we saw how various corona warriors were applauded by several Indians. But having said that, on the question of origins of the virus, there are a lot of claims and counterclaims that we are hearing in the media. How can one establish the original source of novel coronavirus?
Well, at one level it is easy, and at another it is complicated. The way coronaviruses were studied was in the first SARS epidemic. Scientists went to the sites of origin of the epidemic in China, and they went to bat caves and markets and so on, and what they studied was they isolated this virus and they looked at how its gene sequence is, and they found something which is very interesting. What they found was bats incubate these kinds of viruses, and they are sort of an active laboratory for these viruses. And the reason for that is bats have an extraordinary high metabolism when they are flying, and as they are flying they allow these viruses to replicate, but their own immune system contains the spread of the virus in a very effective manner, so they don't get affected. So that is the source. They mix and match and do things in a random way, and they invent keys without knowing what the lock is. And the lock is in our body, and the key is in the bat. And somehow, because they make millions of different kinds of keys, they make one random key which fits in the receptor, which is the lock in our cells. Now, normally we would never meet a bat unless we come in close proximity by living in bat caves, going to bat caves, or using wet markets. If we do that long enough, either from bats or other animals in such situations, and this one we think went from a bat to a pangolin to a human because of the gene sequence, the lock and key fit happens, and then the virus enters us and uses us as a host. So this is an incredible example of the way evolution by natural selection works. The key doesn't know of the existence of the lock, but it plays around with the lock and key in bats and in other animals, but it doesn't know that it fits beautifully with a human lock. But that chance event is made something certain by us coming close to bats or other such animals constantly.
On the Arogya Setu app, if we shift focus on the effort that India is making, which is unprecedented in terms of scale, you've told that to us earlier, as far as digital tracing is concerned, to track, test later for COVID-19. What would you say to those who still have privacy concerns and safety concerns, and will this app be of any use post-COVID crisis?
So, I told you about a vaccine and you asked about herd immunity. Now, herd immunity comes by exposure to the disease. A vaccine gives a population immunity through a vaccination program. What Arogya Setu does is it gives you potentially, if all of us use it, and there's a feature phone version also, it gives you what is called digital immunity. because it tests and tracks at high speed, it allows us to isolate those people who are potential transmitters, make sure they are healthy and well, and then make sure that, you know, they don't transmit. So this kind of a digital immunity is really important. So if we combine testing and tracking with face masks and hand washing and social distancing as we go out into the workforce, if we look after our poorest of the poor and the, you know, people in crowded areas by testing and tracking and facilitating them, then we can open up the economy in a manner which still prevents the disease from spreading disproportionately. Therefore, such apps are really very important, and they have to be combined, be made socially applicable, acceptable, and be combined with other kinds of measures such as hand washing, masks, and so on.
And lastly, Mr. Raghavan, how many people need to download it and operationalize it for it to be successful in terms of percentage of people? If you can tell us in India, what is the kind of percentage that is required for it to be effective?
So many of our teams have made these calculations in great detail. It depends on the nature of the infection and its propagation. If only symptomatic people were propagating, then something like 60% of the people using it would be sufficient. But we know that there's a good chance here that people without symptoms are also likely to be propagators. In that situation, it's important that more and more people use it. And as more use it, you get greater benefit. So you'll get a lot of benefit when 60% use it. You'll get very extraordinary full digital immunity when about 90% use it. And 90% is feasible in a big area, in a railway station, for example, or in a community constantly, because the app has a smartphone version, a feature phone version, and those who don't have a phone at all will be helped by community workers so that they can be contacted about where they went and what they're doing. School children, for example, right? They don't have a phone at all, but there will be a way by which their bus driver, their parents, their teachers, everyone, you know, have a tag about where the kids went, so that if we know that the kids went through this particular area and there was a problem, they can be contacted. So a comprehensive way can be done. It's important. It does not invade privacy any more than CCTV cameras in public places, far less than that actually, because it's used only when there's an issue, when there's someone who's positive. All the data is stored on your phone. It's taken to the server only when someone becomes positive, and it's very secure, and we've done all the security tests for it.
Absolutely. So that's a cue for you to download and operationalize the app if you haven't done that already. Well, thank you, Mr. Raghavan, for speaking to us on DD India. It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much.